The message was blunt, almost clinical in its certainty, as if the outcome had already been decided long before the first aircraft ever moved. There was no hesitation in the language, no ambiguity in the objective. Control was absolute, and the consequences were framed as inevitable. Behind that confidence, however, an immense logistical machine had already begun to turn, quietly assembling the pieces of a strike designed to project overwhelming force in a single decisive motion. Thousands of miles away from the eventual target, at a secluded airfield in the English countryside, that machinery was now visible in its most tangible form. Under dim floodlights and the constant hum of auxiliary power units, long-range bombers stood in rigid formation, their silhouettes stretching across the tarmac like relics of another era that refused to fade into history. At Royal Air Force Station Fairford, activity had intensified to a relentless tempo. The decision to authorize combat operations from British soil had set everything into motion, and now every second mattered. Ground crews moved with deliberate urgency, each action part of a larger sequence that had been rehearsed countless times, yet never under circumstances quite like these. The aircraft themselves, aging yet formidable B-52H Stratofortress bombers, were being transformed from dormant giants into fully armed instruments of precision destruction. Their 8 engines, mounted in pairs beneath swept wings, demanded meticulous attention. Panels were opened, tools clinked against metal, and technicians leaned deep into the exposed compartments, scanning for imperfections that could compromise a mission measured not just in success, but in survival. Each turbine blade was inspected under harsh lighting, rotated slowly by hand as specialists searched for microscopic cracks or debris damage. Even the smallest flaw could cascade into catastrophic failure once airborne. The process was exhaustive, bordering on obsessive, but it reflected the stakes involved. Nearby, heavy vehicles rolled into position carrying payloads that would define the mission's destructive capacity. These hydraulic loaders, guided with precision, lifted massive weapons toward the bombers' open bays. The scale of the ordnance was striking. These were not symbolic displays of force, but carefully selected tools intended to dismantle hardened infrastructure with calculated efficiency. The weapons themselves varied in purpose but shared a common objective: total neutralization of strategic targets. Massive, unguided bombs, each weighing thousands of pounds, were prepared alongside advanced cruise missiles, capable of traveling vast distances before striking with pinpoint accuracy. Precision-guided munitions were also included, designed to penetrate reinforced bunkers and eliminate deeply buried assets. One by one, each piece of ordnance was secured into place, either mounted beneath the wings or loaded into the internal bomb bay, where the aircraft's core delivery system awaited. This system, a rotating launcher hidden within the fuselage, allowed for rapid and sequential deployment without interrupting the bomber's trajectory, a critical advantage during high-risk operations. Technicians ran diagnostics on this internal mechanism, rotating it through full cycles while monitoring electronic connections and release functions. Every lock had to engage flawlessly. Every signal had to register instantly. There was no margin for error once the aircraft reached its target. At the same time, another layer of preparation unfolded away from the flight line, inside briefing rooms where the human component of the mission was being finalized. The crews assigned to these bombers were not just passengers in this operation. They were its executioners, responsible for navigating complex airspace, managing advanced systems, and making split-second decisions under pressure. Inside a secured room, the flight crew reviewed the mission profile in detail. The journey ahead would span several hours each way, crossing multiple regions before reaching the designated strike zone. Oxygen systems were tested, ensuring that high-altitude operations could be sustained without risk. Communication equipment was checked repeatedly, as coordination between crew members and external command structures would be essential. Each individual prepared personal gear with quiet focus, packing essentials that would support them through a mission that could stretch far beyond initial estimates. Once inside the aircraft, the environment shifted from preparation to execution. The cockpit, elevated above the fuselage, became the nerve center of the operation. Pilots secured themselves into ejection seats, surrounded by an array of instruments that would dictate every phase of the flight. Systems were powered on in sequence, screens flickering to life as navigation data was entered with precision. Coordinates, waypoints, and contingency routes were programmed into the onboard computers, forming a digital roadmap that would guide the aircraft across continents. Every gauge was scrutinized. Altitude indicators, airspeed readings, fuel levels, and engine performance metrics were cross-checked against expected parameters. Communication channels were tested, ensuring uninterrupted contact with command and support units. Beneath the cockpit, in a lower compartment isolated from the outside view, 2 additional crew members prepared their own stations. Their roles were equally critical, though less visible. One focused entirely on navigation, continuously verifying the aircraft's position and timing against mission requirements. The other controlled the targeting systems, managing the complex interface that would ultimately determine when and how each weapon was released. This layered structure of responsibility created a system of redundancy and precision. Every action was monitored, every decision supported by overlapping data streams. As the final checks concluded, a quiet tension settled over the aircraft. There was no dramatic countdown, no visible signal marking the transition from preparation to action. Instead, it came as a simple directive, transmitted through secure channels and acknowledged without hesitation. The mission was now active. The bomber began to move, slowly at first, its massive frame rolling across the tarmac under controlled power. Taxi lights illuminated the path ahead as it approached the runway, aligning itself with practiced accuracy. Then, with a steady increase in thrust, the engines roared to life, pushing the aircraft forward with growing intensity. The weight of fuel and weapons demanded a long acceleration, the runway stretching ahead as the bomber gathered speed. For a moment it seemed almost reluctant to leave the ground, as if resisting the inevitability of what lay ahead. Then, with a subtle shift, it lifted into the air, climbing steadily into the darkness and disappearing from view, carrying with it the full force of the operation that had just begun. Once airborne, the transition from controlled ground operations to the vast uncertainty of open sky was immediate and absolute. The aircraft leveled off gradually, climbing to its designated altitude as the coastline of Britain faded behind it. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere remained focused, almost mechanical, as each crew member settled into their role. There was no room for distraction, no tolerance for error. Every second of the flight was governed by procedure, every movement guided by data and discipline. The navigation system continuously updated their position, feeding coordinates into the displays, while the crew cross-checked each waypoint against the preloaded mission plan. The route had been carefully calculated to minimize exposure while maintaining efficiency. Flying southeast across Europe, the bomber passed through controlled airspace with silent coordination from multiple command centers. The Mediterranean stretched below as a dark expanse, broken only by faint clusters of light along distant coastlines. From above, the world appeared calm, almost detached from the operation unfolding in the sky. But inside the aircraft, the reality was far more intense. The crew monitored fuel consumption, engine performance, and external conditions in a constant loop of verification. Every fluctuation, no matter how minor, was noted and assessed. Below the cockpit, the navigator worked methodically, adjusting timing calculations and issuing subtle corrections to maintain the precise flight path. Even a deviation of a few miles could alter the mission's effectiveness. Beside him, the radar navigator studied the systems that would soon transition from passive observation to active targeting. Multiple screens displayed layers of information: terrain mapping, potential threats, and pre-programmed target data. The complexity of the interface demanded full concentration, each input carrying significant consequences. As the aircraft approached its final approach corridor, the tempo shifted. Communications became more concise, more deliberate. External support systems provided updated intelligence, confirming that conditions within the target zone remained consistent with initial projections. The crew acknowledged each update without commentary, their focus narrowing to the task ahead. The transition from transit to engagement was not marked by any dramatic signal, but rather by a series of quiet confirmations that aligned perfectly with the mission timeline. When the target area came within operational range, the bombardier initiated the next phase. Coordinates were verified again, cross-referenced against onboard systems and external data feeds. The aircraft maintained altitude and speed, holding a steady course that allowed the weapon systems to function with maximum precision. Then, with a controlled command, the internal bay doors opened, exposing the payload to the rushing air below. The shift was subtle, but significant, a physical signal that the mission had entered its most critical stage. Inside the bomb bay, the rotary launcher began its measured rotation. Each movement was smooth, deliberate, bringing the first weapon into position. There was no hesitation. At the exact, calculated moment, the release command was executed. One by one, the weapons separated from the aircraft, disappearing into the darkness beneath. Some would fall directly, guided by gravity and onboard systems, while others would ignite their own propulsion, traveling independently toward hardened targets far beyond visual range. The sequence continued in rapid succession, each release confirmed through instrumentation before the next was initiated. The bombardier tracked every deployment, watching as the system cycled through its payload with relentless efficiency. Data streams confirmed separation, trajectory, and estimated impact. There was no visible explosion from the aircraft's vantage point, only the knowledge that each weapon was now following its programmed path toward a designated objective. The entire process, from the opening of the bay doors to the final release, lasted only minutes, yet it represented the culmination of hours of preparation and decades of technological evolution. As the last weapon cleared the aircraft, the bay doors closed, sealing the fuselage once more. The bomber did not linger. Almost immediately it began its turn away from the target area, banking smoothly as it transitioned back into a defensive posture. The mission, at least from the crew's perspective, had shifted from execution to withdrawal. But the tension did not ease. If anything, it intensified. The aircraft was now lighter, faster, and more vulnerable. Its primary objective completed, but its journey far from over. The return route had been deliberately altered, avoiding a direct path back to its origin. Instead, the bomber set course toward Eastern Europe, where a designated airfield awaited. This deviation was not a sign of uncertainty, but a calculated measure designed to preserve flexibility and extend operational reach. Fuel levels were monitored closely, though reserves remained sufficient. The decision to refuel was strategic, ensuring that the aircraft could adapt to any unforeseen developments without limitation. As the bomber crossed back over familiar territory, the environment inside the aircraft began to shift subtly. The immediate intensity of the strike phase gave way to a controlled vigilance. Systems continued to be monitored, checklists reviewed, and communications maintained. But there was a quiet acknowledgement that the most dangerous portion of the mission had passed. Still, no one relaxed. Not yet. Hours later, the aircraft descended toward its temporary destination. The runway lights appeared ahead, cutting through the darkness as the bomber aligned for landing. Speed was reduced carefully, altitude adjusted with precision. Then, upon touchdown, a large drag parachute deployed from the rear of the aircraft, expanding rapidly and pulling against the forward momentum. The deceleration was immediate, controlled, bringing the massive bomber to a safe stop within the available runway length. But even as the aircraft rolled to a halt, the broader operation continued to unfold. This was not a single strike, but part of a sustained effort. Far beyond this landing, another phase was already in motion, one that would ensure the pressure never eased and the objective remained firmly within reach. While the aircraft on the European front completed its carefully planned diversion and recovery, an entirely separate chain of events had already begun unfolding across the Atlantic. The operation was never intended to rely on a single strike or a limited window of action. It was structured as a continuous cycle, designed to maintain pressure without interruption, ensuring that momentum never slowed and the initiative never shifted. At a strategic bomber base in the United States, preparations were already underway for the next phase, initiated almost immediately after confirmation that the first wave had executed its mission. Inside a secured briefing room, another crew absorbed the details of their assignment with quiet intensity. The tone was consistent with what had been established from the beginning: direct, controlled, and devoid of unnecessary explanation. The objective was not debated, it was accepted. Their role was clear. They were to move their aircraft across the Atlantic, integrate into the forward operating position, and be ready to continue strike operations without delay. The timeline allowed for no hesitation. Everything had been arranged so that the transition between crews and aircraft would appear seamless, almost invisible from the outside. The aircraft assigned to them was already waiting on the ramp, its preparation completed in advance. Maintenance teams had worked through the previous hours, ensuring that every system was operational, every component verified. Fuel tanks were filled to capacity, weapons had been loaded, and diagnostics had been run repeatedly to eliminate any possibility of failure during the long transoceanic flight. From a distance, the bomber appeared motionless, but up close, it carried the unmistakable presence of a machine poised for immediate action. The crew approached with a measured pace, carrying their flight gear and equipment. Survival kits, mission documents, and provisions for the extended journey were loaded methodically into the aircraft. Each item had its place, each detail accounted for. There was no wasted movement, no unnecessary conversation. The process reflected a routine that had been refined over years, yet the underlying urgency was impossible to ignore. This was not a standard deployment. It was part of a larger sequence already in motion. Once aboard, the crew moved through their assigned stations, initiating the familiar sequence of system checks. Power was applied, instruments illuminated, and the cockpit transformed into a controlled environment of data and communication. The pilots reviewed their route across the Atlantic, confirming weather conditions, air traffic coordination points, and contingency plans. Unlike shorter missions, this flight would stretch across vast open water, requiring sustained concentration and precise management of fuel and navigation. As clearance was granted, the bomber began its slow movement toward the runway. The process mirrored what had occurred thousands of miles away earlier, yet the context was different. This was not the strike phase, but the reinforcement phase, the quiet extension of operational reach that ensured continuity. Engines surged as the aircraft accelerated, lifting into the sky and turning eastward, leaving the American coastline behind as it committed fully to the crossing. Hours passed in steady progression, the ocean stretching endlessly below. Inside the aircraft, the rhythm of the flight settled into a controlled routine. The navigator continuously tracked position, comparing real-time data against projected coordinates. Even over open water, precision remained critical. Small deviations could compound over distance, affecting arrival timing and coordination with forward operations. The radar navigator monitored atmospheric conditions, scanning for weather systems that could impact the flight path, while electronic monitoring systems remained active, a constant safeguard, even in what was considered secure airspace. The isolation of the transatlantic environment created a unique tension. There were no visible landmarks, no immediate reference points beyond the instruments. The aircraft existed in a self-contained world of gauges, signals, and calculated motion. Yet despite the apparent calm, the mission retained its intensity. Every system had to function flawlessly for the entire duration of the flight. There was no opportunity for external support beyond what had already been planned. That support came in the form of aerial refueling, a critical component of long-range bomber operations. As the aircraft approached the designated rendezvous point, the crew began scanning for confirmation of the tanker's position. Soon, a distant contact appeared on radar, gradually resolving into the unmistakable signature of a refueling aircraft. Communication was established, brief and precise, as both crews coordinated their approach. The bomber adjusted its altitude and speed, positioning itself carefully behind and below the tanker. The maneuver required steady control and absolute focus. Even minor instability could disrupt the connection process. As the distance closed, the tanker's refueling boom extended downward, a rigid structure guided by an operator watching from the rear of the aircraft. The bomber moved into position beneath it, maintaining a delicate balance of speed and alignment. Inside the cockpit, the pilots held the aircraft steady, making minute adjustments to remain perfectly aligned. Then, with careful precision, the boom connected with the receptacle on the bomber's upper fuselage. The connection was firm, and within moments, fuel began to transfer. It was a quiet exchange, but one that carried immense importance. This transfer extended the aircraft's operational range, ensuring it could complete its journey and arrive fully prepared for what awaited ahead. The refueling process lasted several minutes, each one monitored closely. Fuel levels rose steadily, systems remained stable, and the connection held without interruption. Once complete, the boom disengaged smoothly, retracting back toward the tanker. The bomber eased away, creating distance before resuming its forward trajectory. There was no pause, no lingering. The mission demanded continuous movement. With the refueling complete, the aircraft pressed on toward its destination. Ahead lay the European theater, where the previous strike had already taken place and where the next phase was waiting to begin. The transition between operations was carefully synchronized, designed to ensure that as one aircraft completed its role, another was ready to take its place. It was a cycle built on precision, coordination, and an unwavering commitment to maintaining control over every stage of the operation. As the reinforced aircraft closed in on European airspace, the operation entered a phase where timing became as critical as firepower. The distance between continents had been reduced to a sequence of calculated checkpoints, each one confirming that the broader design was unfolding exactly as intended. There was no visible hand guiding the process, yet every movement suggested a level of coordination that left little to chance. The incoming bomber was not arriving into uncertainty, but into a structure already prepared to receive it, integrate it, and send it forward again with minimal delay. This was not a pause between actions. It was a continuation, a seamless extension of pressure that refused to give the situation any opportunity to stabilize. Inside the aircraft, fatigue began to edge into the margins of focus, but it never fully took hold. Training and repetition sustained the crew through the long hours, each member relying on discipline rather than comfort. The coastline of Europe eventually emerged ahead, faint at first and then unmistakable, signaling the end of the transatlantic crossing. Communication channels became more active as the aircraft entered controlled corridors, its presence acknowledged and guided through layers of airspace that had already been cleared for its passage. Every instruction was brief, efficient, and immediately executed. The descent toward the forward operating base was gradual, controlled to preserve both fuel efficiency and system stability. From above, the airfield revealed itself in precise geometry, illuminated runways cutting through the surrounding darkness. Ground crews were already in position, anticipating arrival with the same level of readiness that had defined the earlier launch. As the bomber aligned with the runway, its speed decreased in carefully measured increments. The landing was firm but controlled, the aircraft's weight settling onto the tarmac as a drag parachute deployed behind it, expanding rapidly to bring the massive frame to a halt. There was no prolonged shutdown sequence, no extended recovery period. The moment the aircraft reached its designated position, ground teams moved in, initiating a rapid turnaround process that had been meticulously planned in advance. Refueling lines were connected, diagnostic systems engaged, and external inspections began almost immediately. The aircraft had arrived not to rest, but to be reset. Every minute on the ground was accounted for, each action aligned with a schedule that left no room for delay. The objective was clear: restore full operational capability as quickly as possible, and prepare for the next sortie. Inside the command structure overseeing the operation, information flowed continuously. Data from previous strikes was analyzed in real time, assessing effectiveness, identifying any remaining targets, and adjusting future tasking accordingly. There was no assumption that a single wave had achieved total completion. Instead, the operation was treated as an evolving sequence, one that adapted based on results and intelligence updates. This constant evaluation ensured that each subsequent action would be more precise, more focused, and more impactful than the last. Back on the flight line, the newly arrived bomber underwent its transformation from transit platform to strike asset. Weapons crews moved into position with practiced efficiency, preparing to load the next set of munitions. Each piece of ordnance was selected based on updated targeting requirements, reflecting the dynamic nature of the operation. The internal systems were recalibrated, navigation data refreshed, and mission parameters uploaded into the aircraft's computers. What had been a long-distance flight only hours before was now becoming an active component of an ongoing offensive. The crew, despite the demands of the journey, remained engaged in the process. Briefings were updated, responsibilities reaffirmed, and contingency plans reviewed once more. There was no sense of finality, no indication that the operation was nearing completion. Instead, everything pointed toward istimrar, a deliberate continuation of pressure designed to achieve a defined outcome through persistence rather than a single decisive moment. Each sortie, each movement, each calculation contributed to a larger objective that extended beyond any individual mission. As preparations neared completion, the aircraft stood ready once again, its systems aligned, its payload secured, and its crew prepared to execute the next phase. The runway awaited, illuminated and silent, a path leading back into the same sky that had carried it across an ocean only hours earlier. There would be no announcement marking the transition, no dramatic signal indicating that another cycle was about to begin. It would happen the same way it always had, through a quiet directive, acknowledged without hesitation, and followed by motion. The engines would surge, the aircraft would accelerate, and the operation would continue, uninterrupted and unrelenting, extending its reach with each passing hour. There was no illusion about what this represented. It was not a single strike, not an isolated event, but a sustained demonstration of capability and control. And as long as the structure behind it remained intact, the cycle would repeat, again and again, until there was nothing left to contest it.